Okay, so here we go. This is the intro video for chapter 13, which is the first section of the motor system, and it's on the spinal cord. So just a few things. I really spent a lot of time on the PowerPoint for this chapter, so it should be very clear. Make sure you go through the PowerPoint as you're going through the book, because there's a lot in this chapter that I think is far too in-depth than what is needed for this course. So make sure if there's any of the sections that are not touched upon on the PowerPoints, you are not responsible for. So mostly what the chapter is focusing on, and what I want you to know, is some of the basic anatomy of the spinal cord, which we've already covered in an earlier chapter. And then the book talks about how the spinal cord is segmented, and that's the divisions of cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and the sacral divisions. Make sure you understand that. Make sure you understand what a dermatome is, and that is the section of the body that's controlled by a particular section of the spinal cord. Now, your text talks about dermatomes being the motor control, or maybe it's the sensory, and then the myotomes being the motor. But you can just consider it a dermatome. I've always just heard it discussed as the motor and the sensory all together in a dermatome. So mostly just understand that the dermatome is the part of the body that is controlled by that particular segment of the spinal cord. The book... Well, one thing that I'll say is that the PowerPoint follows the book pretty well, but I also felt like some of the text was not the most ideal organization. So if you you might find a little bit more in depth in the PowerPoint. For instance, there's one small section in the book on the motor unit, and then it switches to descending tracts, which I just didn't think really made sense, because then it came back to the motor unit and the difference between the alpha motor neurons and a bunch more stuff that involves the motor unit. So I put that all together in the PowerPoint, and it should be pretty clear. You do need to have a general understanding of the descending motor tracts. You don't have to worry about the ascending tracts, although it's basically just one paragraph in the text. That was covered in the sensory system. Now, the trickiest thing about this chapter is understanding how the alpha-gamma motor loop, and basically how our muscles contract. Now, your book goes into a little more detail than I would like you to, have to know. So pay more attention to the figures that are in the PowerPoint. Several of the figures on this topic came from another resource, and I think they were more clear. And there's a few things in some of the figures in the text that I'm not going to hold you responsible for. And it says that in the PowerPoints. But one of the things is that the text talks about, in regards to intrafusal muscle fibers, nuclear chain fibers and nuclear bag fibers. We're not going to worry about the difference between those two things. We're just going to consider it intrafusal fibers, or muscle spindles is another way of talking about it. So make sure you just look through that. Just briefly, what happens is that the alpha motor neurons are the primary neurons that tell our muscles to contract. So the cell bodies of the alpha motor neurons are in the spinal cord, and when those are activated, they connect to the extrafusal muscle fibers, and then that muscle contracts. But our muscles are also contain intrafusal muscle fibers, and intrafusal fibers lie parallel to extrafusal fibers, and they're also called muscle spindles. These fibers are actually wrapped by a type of sensory afferent nerve called 1A afferents, and those afferents' job is to detect the length of the spindles. Now, the spindles contract. They're controlled by gamma motor neurons. So the two motor neurons we have are alpha motor neurons and gamma motor neurons. Alpha motor neurons control the extrafusal fibers. Gamma motor neurons control the intrafusal fibers. When the system is working normally, alpha and gamma motor neurons contract together. The other thing is that alpha motor neurons are controlled by the pyramidal system and gamma motor neurons are controlled by the extrapyramidal system. Pyramidal. I always say pyramidal, but well, I was corrected in my neuroscience class that it's pyramidal. Anyways, so when the system is working well, the alpha and the gamma motor neurons send a signal, and so that the extrafusal fibers and the intrafusal fibers contract together. When the reason we have the spindles and the sensory system that's connected to the spindles is to protect the muscle from overstretch. So if the muscle is overstretched, it can damage the muscle. So the afferents fibers that wrap around the muscle spindles are detecting the length of the spindles relative to the length of the extrafusal fibers. So when a muscle is stretched, the spindles are, the muscle spindles stretch quick, and those will then, because the muscle spindle is longer than the extrafusal fibers, or the intrafusal fibers are longer than the extrafusal fibers, that will suddenly send a signal to the spinal cord that the muscle is at risk for overstretch, and that will cause the muscle to contract. So this is called the stretch reflex. Now there's some videos embedded in the PowerPoint that go over this and make it very clear. You do need to understand it, because we often see patients that have a problem where the extrapyramidal system is not working correctly, so that the muscle spindles don't contract with the extrafusal fibers. And so if those spindles don't contract, then they're longer than the extrafusal fibers. And so then it sends a signal to the spinal cord or the brain to contract the muscle. And then these patients end up with muscle spasticity. So we're not going to go into that into too much detail, but I do want you to just kind of have a general understanding that that's why when patients have upper motor neuron damage, it generally results in muscle spasticity. So that's where the muscle is constantly contracted, and it has to do with the malfunctioning of the stretch reflex, because the intrafusal fibers are chronically longer than the extrafusal fibers. So it's telling the brain to keep contracting the muscle because the intrafusal fibers thinks the muscle is actually being overstretched, and in actuality it's actually being contracted. So make sure you review those videos, and if you have any questions about that, make sure you contact me and I'll try to explain it more. It can be a little bit tricky, but I think it's pretty clear in the PowerPoint. Okay, just a couple of other things about the chapter. Towards the end, when it gets into the spinal reflexes, all I want you to know is that general stretch reflex. You do not have to know withdrawal or flexor reflexes that your book goes into. You don't have to know the cross or intrasegmental extensor reflexes, but you do. And then the book talks about, which is not necessarily well, it is kind of a reflex, but you do need to know some basics about respiration and that system, and the PowerPoints and the book are pretty clear about it. Basically, there's not much else I need to tell you in the intro. There is a little bit of stuff in the text about some different spinal cord syndromes. You're only responsible for the ones that are in the PowerPoint, and there's just a few. Okay, so that's it for the intro, and let me know if you guys have any questions.